our speaker. Please don't forget that on May 18th we have Liz Schroeder from OSU coming to present the impact of microcredit borrowing on household consumption in Bangladesh. So this would be your last seminar lecture for this term, and it's happening once again on May 18th. Here, same place, same time. So make note of that, and also at the end, please, for those of you who haven't picked up assignments, see me. So today what we have is Gavin Wright, who yesterday, how many of you were able to attend the lecture yesterday? I'm hoping that that was able to whet your appetite for today's talk. Gavin Wright is the William Robertson Poe, Professor of American Economic History at Stanford University. We're honored to have you here. And without further ado, I would like to open the floor to you to let us know about the segregation of labor markets. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been an honor and a pleasure to be here to give a banner lecture yesterday and to speak to you today. And I must say, I'm always impressed at any university where people will turn out on a beautiful Friday afternoon to hear a serious talk about economics. So in honor of that occasion, I'm going to take my jacket. Now, as was said in the introduction, yesterday was History Rules, where people listen politely, and then there's a Q&A session at the end. So today it's Economics Rules, and that is you can interrupt with a question any time. You still have to be polite, and I have the privilege of saying, no, if I'm going to get to it later, I may put it off. But you should understand, I believe most all of you are studying economics or in some way related to economics, and the issue I'm dealing with, the questions I'm dealing with, fundamentally I'm trying to understand the impact of what I call the Civil Rights Revolution, and that mainly means the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as well as the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but it's the employment chapter of the Civil Rights Act of 64 that I'm mainly talking about today. And I want to understand it from an economic point of view because I believe it had a revolutionary effect in desegregating southern labor markets, and that this was a major advance, certainly for African Americans in the South. And I say, as I said yesterday in a more general framework, I say it was an advance for the southern regional economy as a whole, which is a way of saying that desegregation primarily benefited African Americans, but not primarily at the expense of white Southerners. And so I want to try to understand this, given that I see the record that way, I want to understand how can we make sense of this in terms of economics. So the first slide, there we go, and I don't know what I point at here. So yes, today, this being Economics Rules, I have a few of these bullet point slides, although mostly I'll still be showing pictures. This is the way the argument will unfold. I don't think you can really say what effect did the Act have without having some characterization or some interpretation of how the labor market situation stood prior to 1964. That is, how did segregation operate as a labor market principle? Because you know, and the main analytical discussions on this trace back to Gary Becker's book, classic book from 1957 on the economics of discrimination. You can have segregation without labor market discrimination. In fact, if what you have is a situation where white workers don't care to work with black workers in close proximity, some sort of distaste or hostility or desire for social distance, the logical remedy for a profit-seeking employer is separate them, put them in different rooms. Or maybe it would work out across industries, and in the extreme, in equilibrium, you can have an outcome that involves segregation and no unjustified wage differential by race. So I'm going to start from a situation all the way back in the turn of the 20th century period where it appears that that's pretty much exactly what happened. But then I will be arguing that a racial wage gap emerged across the 20th century. So this is not just some ancient tradition the way it always was, disrupted by new federal legislation. No, this is something that emerged over time and was a challenge. How's that going to be? Using a model that I will call the Arrow-Schwab equilibrium wage gap. My esteemed Nobel Prize-winning colleague, Ken Arrow, really wrote some of the classic analyses of the economics of discrimination in the early 1970s, and then I'll be referring you to an article by Stuart Schwab in the American Economic Review that kind of makes that more accessible. Where segregation went from being a horizontal separation that facilitated wage equilibration to being a vertical separation that facilitated a wage distance between whites and blacks. And of course, part of that is going to have to do with unequal education. So there's no way to get around that. Big-time political change between 1890 and 1910, which opened up huge discrepancy in the allocation of resources between the white schools and the black schools. They were always segregated, but the huge spending differential was a consequence of disfranchisement. So this actually does plug back into the voting rights issue, even though it's kind of in the background. And then I will argue that this separation was maintained by prejudice, expectations, and perhaps counterintuitively out-migration, in the sense that those African Americans in the South who somehow fought the uphill battle to get educated despite all the disincentives, the employment opportunities for them within the region were so restricted that out-migration was a feasible, seemed like the best opportunity for them in most cases. Out-migration seems like an inefficient outcome. You're investing in the education of a person only to find that person leaving. We call that brain drain in the development literature. But in terms of the viability and sustainability of the segregated Jim Crow economy from the standpoint of the white population and leadership, it was actually a kind of a safety valve. So that's going to be the situation, and then the Civil Rights Act came in and broke down the segregation barriers and changed the incentives and opportunities for education. So there's actually quite a bit of history packed into this one slide. I don't expect you to get it all immediately, but let me now go back to the start. So I mentioned the Arrow-Schwab analysis. So the context is what is known as statistical discrimination. And so you think about an employer who is facing hiring decisions, and the employer has to decide on who to hire, what criteria to hire, and what wage to pay. So this is not an analysis where the employer is just facing a wage in the going labor market. Maybe that's the way it was in the farm labor market, where you just have large numbers of undifferentiated farm workers, and everybody pretty much knows what the going rate is. But when you get into the industrial sector, which is what I'm talking about, you've got to worry about labor quality. And the basic idea is, it's related to the efficiency wage idea, the higher the wage you offer, the more favorable the cut of the skill or quality distribution is. So we get these upward sloping relationships between wage and average quality is U. And so, as Stuart Schwab lays it out in this article here, AER 1986, the equilibrium is where the wage equals U. So you're getting equilibration. You could call it marginal product if you plug it into a production function, but it's really saying you're paying the wage equal to the average quality of this group of heterogeneous workers. You're trading off higher costs for a higher wage against the higher quality that you can get, and that higher quality is manifest in a number of different ways. The ability to select, the ability to fire people, as well as perhaps the motivation for the workers. Now, if you're working that way as an employer, you can do better. If you can make a simple separation of that one large pool of job applicants into two. One that you know is higher on average than the other which you know is lower. And that's the logic of racial discrimination as a form of statistical discrimination. So these are the two equilibriums in the Stuart Schwab analysis. Each one is an equilibrium, and the races are separate, and you might just say, well, race was so salient, so convenient an indicator. In some of the Arrow models, you can actually start out with no skill differential at all between the races. But in this context that I'm talking about, the emergence of a wage differential across the years from, I'll be looking at about 1908 up to about 1926, it coincided with a huge differential in educational investments. So that it actually was a pretty rational perspective from the point of view of the employer to say that, you know, if you have a white applicant and a black applicant walking through the door at the same time, you know pretty darn well that the white applicant is going to have a better education, more years and more quality and better qualified teachers than the black applicant. So that's where it starts, and the question is there any real reason for that to change? That's a popular analysis, or it's a convenient analysis that many economists have latched onto because it's not really intellectually challenging. You're saying, yeah, the root of the problem was in the school system, and the root of the school system was in politics, and so it doesn't pose the kind of difficulty for us. Yeah, nobody ever said politics was efficient or fair. In this case, it was particularly inefficient and fair. Okay, end of story, but I'm going to try to say that's not the end of the story. There's more to it. So don't get your hopes up for, if you're thinking way up here about econometric labor empirical analysis, well, no, moderate your thinking. It is very, very hard to actually get in American history anywhere wage data on a racial basis, even in the segregated South. You can kind of infer the differential from knowing something about the segregation patterns by job and by industry, and really that's what I've done. So I used the wage data from the labor reports, Bureau of Labor Statistics, of the state of Virginia. And you may feel, Virginia, well, that's not really the heart of the South, but actually Virginia had within itself most of the major industries reflected in the South, and the patterns of segregation were very much industry specific, so that I think Virginia is actually not a bad state to use, but in any case, it's the only one I have. Let me show you what I've come up with. These are just frequency distributions. What we have here is the wage level. A daily wage was the way wages were typically quoted at the time. And then you have frequency distributions, which is the percentage of the white workers, which is this curve here, and then the percentage of the black workers, which is this curve here. And I'm aggregating these across the labor market in which segregation was the order of the day. Robert Higgs has an article analyzing, also in the AER, this very data, and he reports looking at the job categories and the industries. Most of them were segregated. You have a few with mixed labor force, not many. So we have a highly race-conscious society, segregation prevails. What do we find in the way of wage distributions? We find that the peak of the distribution was almost exactly the same for the whites and for the blacks. So I'm calling this the unskilled labor market. I don't know that, but it looks to me like this would be the unskilled. It's the largest number. Now, there's this other thing out here in which there's a big white advantage, almost no black representation. That's coming from the construction industry. This curve is aggregating manufacturing and construction. Construction industry was highly unionized. The unions were highly racially exclusive, a case where their racial prejudice reinforced their economic motive towards exclusivity. So, in short, you might look at this curve and you might say, you know, there's no racial wage gap. What you have is a skill gap. The skill gap being related to access to the skilled jobs, and the skilled job access is being limited by lily white unions. That's what we have. It really fits the Becker model pretty well. Discrimination being located in unionized sectors, and otherwise you get a pretty high degree of equilibration at a wage that happens to be about $1 a day. So maybe the round numbers were convenient, but in addition, pretty much the same. You should also remember, this information is all about manufacturing and construction, but in the background you have a much larger agricultural sector. And even though most of the labor force in agriculture would be tenant farmers, family farmers, tenant farmers, sharecroppers, there was a relatively large wage labor population, especially for young men, black men and white men, and that was a case where there is virtually no evidence of a racial wage differential per se in farm labor. Big differential in wealth and in status and so on, but farm labor, it fits the Becker idea that you cannot maintain a wage differential in favor of whites just on the basis of preference. Because why should you pay a worker any more than you could pay another worker who's just as good just because he's black? You might practice segregation, but you're going to be paying the same. To use the vernacular of the time, you can get a white worker at a black wage. This is really where I started. My first book, Old South, New South, was the realization that you really had a functioning labor market. Once again, economists, maybe we're all prone to this. You want to latch on to the handiest, simplest explanation for anything, and so the one that comes to mind here is post-Civil War South. They abolished slavery on paper, but they didn't really abolish it in practice. They had kind of quasi-slavery under another name. It just does not work. You had a lot of mobility in the post-war South, and mobility for black workers as well as white. I'm not saying a lot of economic mobility, I'm saying geographic mobility. There was a market, and that's why this is a challenge for economic analysis. The next graph pulls the construction sector out of it, just looking at manufacturing, and it's even more striking. Yeah, there's an edge. The white workers are getting promoted to these jobs, such as they were, but the bulk of the whites were getting essentially the same wage as the blacks. All right, but that's how it stood in 1908. Let's scroll forward to 1926.
What is,
Yeah.
sorry, what is the blip before the jewel started?
I don't really know. I
Okay.
think it might be something like apprenticeships, something where you're getting a super, these are the internships, they're mostly for whites, and they're getting a low wage, but presumably they're getting some reward for it in the form of training or access to the jobs later on. That's speculation, but it would be a way of making sense of it. 1926, same industry, same state. I've tried to stabilize everything that I could. Look, a racial wage gap had opened up. If I'm right that this is the unskilled labor market, somehow unskilled has come to have two different meanings, one for whites and one for blacks. Now you ask, what happened? Why should this have, it's the same society, they didn't change their attitudes in any fundamental way. You could think of all kinds of possibilities. Some of them would have to do with industry-specific changes going on. The agricultural sector was very depressed in the 1920s, so that had a disproportionate effect on blacks. World War I had different effects, and so on. But the one that economists have most likely to kind of latch onto is that change in the educational background. These are the group, the Jim Crow generation, finally hitting the labor market in the 20s, and the whites are substantially more educated than the blacks. And you shouldn't ask the question. Sometimes people will say, you really didn't need education to be a productive worker in, say, the textiles industry or the tobacco industry. They didn't require education. Almost all of the studies of early industrialization show that you do get a positive payoff to primary education. Even in kinds of work that you might not think would have an effect, it does seem to have an effect. And I think the way to think about it in the spirit of the statistical discrimination model is that if you have a more educated labor force pool, you can raise the standards. You can begin to give them written instructions, if they can be. So it's not so much that it requires more education. There isn't a rigid, specific requirement. It's that you can, knowing that your white workers are more educated, you can expect more of them. And indeed, that is what was happening in textiles, which was the oldest and most rapidly growing industry, and it was almost exclusively white. So I'm saying, this is what I mean when I say that the racial discrimination, the kind of entry-level discrimination or gap based on skin color, yes, you may want to link it back to educational discrimination. I'm fine with that, but I want to make another point. And the other point is that that difference in education was not independent of what was happening in the labor market. That you had feedback effects from the labor market onto the demand for schooling. Because after all, you might ask the question, okay, it's fine to say schooling, that's politics, politics is inefficient and unfair, but you know, you have enlightened entrepreneurs and employers, wouldn't they have an interest in improving the schools so that they would improve the quality of their labor force? Yeah, they might. But that enlightened perspective was heavily influenced by race, and the feedback effect is, well, it's just an illustration. What I'm saying is, if you begin to get a world in which, yes, better quality, high-paying jobs are opening up, but blacks are not going to be accepted in those jobs, then there is a big discouragement for blacks to continue their education and for white taxpayers and politicians to invest in improving black schools. So over and over again, the planners had a direct adverse interest. They say, yeah, you educate a field hand and you've lost one field hand. As soon as they learn to read, write, and cipher, they want to go to town. Whereas there was one large interest group here with an active interest in keeping down the quality of black schools. But here was a group, the Rosenwald Fund. Rosenwald was the head of Sears Roebuck, and he wanted to invest, and did invest heavily, in upgrading southern schools, and he wanted to do that for blacks as well as whites. He was a enlightened outsider, so you can't say that, you know, you can always invoke social pressure, peer pressure, embarrassment, and so on. This was an outsider. He wanted to upgrade black schools as well as white, so one of the things he did was to sponsor a survey, to say we're going to promote black high schools, and tell us what kinds of jobs that blacks might be qualified for could we put into the curriculum of the high school. And of course the survey results came back. There are no jobs for which blacks are eligible, for which a high school education is required. And of course, he had the idea, which a lot of outsiders did, we want to do good for both races, but we don't want to tamper with Southern sensibilities. They're so traditional, so deeply entrenched, and they found you just could not do it. One of the key issues here, I was asked the question yesterday, where do women fit in? Well, here's a place where women fit in. I mean, one of the growing job categories in this period of history was office work. Young women getting a high school degree. It's one of the oddities. You know, the country has long been unequal between men and women, and yet we have educated our women all the way back to the 18th century. You know, we wanted to be able to read the Bible, teach their kids to read, and so on. Even though they were excluded from most jobs, other than being high school teachers, so it was a way of subsidizing education. But clerical work was a growing job category, heavily populated by women between 1910 and 1940, but those courses were not offered at the black schools. And how was this rationalized? Well, here's an example. This is an expert. He had no vested interest, but he says, if commercial courses were offered in the Negro school, there would no doubt be tremendous pressure to get into them, and the only result would be keen disappointment for almost everyone. Sure, we can look back and say, it's a reverse equilibrium. Can't they see that this would contribute to toppling the system? But that was what they said they didn't want to do. That would have been unacceptable. This is what I mean when I say I think it was an equilibrium type relationship. And here's an extreme case. I suppose you might question the inference, but a man named James Field applied for a job in a union bag in Savannah in the 1940s. He really wanted that job, but he'd heard that they didn't want no smart black man. So when he filled out his application, he put in 9th grade instead of 12th, because I figured they didn't want no smart black man in order to get hired. I was hired. Now, it's true, of course, that he did have the 12th grade degree, so maybe he was exceptional, but he felt he had to disguise his level of education in order to get this job. And for the types of jobs that he was applying for, that blacks were eligible for, that 12th grade education not only didn't enhance his hireability, it actually may have reduced it. Troublemaker, overqualified. Probably heard that term, overqualified for some job that you really wanted. Well, that was a regular experience. Now here's a rare survey by the Labor Department in the middle of the 1930s. Entry-level wages by industry, 20 industries around the country. So I don't know if entry-level should be equated with what I call the unskilled category. But at least it's very useful in that you don't have to control for experience on the job. We wish we had controls for education and other things. But the point is, we can compare North and South in these 20 manufacturing industries. For the USA, you see this 27% differential between blacks and whites. But if you look at the North, plenty of racism, plenty of discrimination in the North, but it took a different form. It wasn't institutionalized, so to speak, in the labor market the way it was in the South. So you actually get a slightly higher average entry-level wage for blacks than whites, which I assume is a compositional thing, blacks working in things like the steel industry, which tend to be relatively high pay. And at that point also, because of Henry Ford, blacks, the color line had been broken in the auto industry, and that was a relatively high-paying industry. So basically, no wage discrimination per se, or at least not in this. I mean, some labor economists think wage discrimination means some complicated residual in a very long regression equation. I think you can actually look at a functioning labor market, and this at least gets us a little closer to it, and ask yourself, was there a wage differential? With a couple of colleagues, we did a big study of the records of the Ford Motor Company. Ford was an obsessive record keeper, and he hired a lot of black workers, and we found no racial wage gap at all. And we came to the conclusion there really was a norm of equal pay in the North. I mean, blacks were assigned to the most disagreeable jobs. I'm not saying it was fair or equal treatment. I'm just saying the inequality did not take the form of a racial wage difference. South, completely different. The overall differential was 25.8. And if you look at those which were segregated, those hiring whites only, the average pay was 44.4. Those hiring blacks only were less than 30, so that is a 50% wage differential. So I think it supports my claim that by the 30s, segregation had come to support a vertical wage differential, whereas those that hired both blacks and whites would still have a wage differential, although it was much lower. Yeah?
There doesn't seem to be perfectly consistency between the first three lines, because the U.S. has to be some sort of weighted average of the North and South, right?
Well, if you take 27.1 and add minus 2.5.
Oh, that's right.
Don't you get about...
Yeah, right.
No, 15 seconds ago, I was looking at that number and asking, I hope nobody asked me about this, but now that you did, I can see the answer. It's that little negative number that makes it add up. Now, presumably, they have to be weighted, and I don't know what the weights are, but somehow it always comes out right. Yeah.
If you break down male versus female, what kind of picture are you going to get?
I don't know, but what I think is that it was pretty much equally bad for both. And I'll show you a picture in a couple of slides that will maybe support that. You know, one of the analyses that you get, even back in 1908, where you seem to have, in some sense, equilibration between blacks and whites at the entry level or the unskilled level, but of course that's misleading because blacks were pretty much stuck. Black men were pretty much stuck. You know, you put in a day's hard work and you get a decent wage for the times, but you weren't going anywhere in the way of upward mobility, which is why blacks would, if they were going to move into any avenue of work that had any advancement possibility, it would be agriculture, because at least in agriculture they could start as a sharecropper, and if they succeeded, they'd move up to tenancy, and a small number, but a non-trivial number, actually became farm owners. Now, of course, those opportunities were disappearing, even in the 20s, with the decline in the cotton economy. But the feature that people are focused on is that in terms of the basis for viable households in the times, the kind of male breadwinner family, sure, young women who were working tended to be typecast into a very limited range of jobs. They often paid piecework, so they could get a decent work, but no investment in the future. They were not going to be, the assumption was they were not going to stay. So that the level of discrimination at the entry level was not that high, but the prospective future advancement was pretty bad for women, both black and white. Now, the reason, here's the reason, well, let me go to this slide. I'll try to stay in order and not hop around. This is going to be my analysis of what happened in 1964. This was the South's largest industry, and you might think that this defies all economic logic. Now, here's a low-wage, labor-abundant economy, and the one sector where it is moving ahead and taking over the national market from the historic New England industry, it's textiles. Textiles is the classic early industrialization starting industry, and yet they're doing it with only a portion of the population. It was an all-white industry, virtually, until 1964. Except for male outside janitorial jobs, and it changed abruptly after 1964, and I say this was a genuine part of the Civil Rights Revolution, even though most of the history books barely even mention it. Really, this whole area of labor is largely left out, and that's part of the reason why the outcome seems to be often pessimistic and questioning whether the revolution really did anything from an economic standpoint. I say it did, but you really have to look at the labor side. And this is going to be my perhaps most controversial, but I'm going to make it as sympathetically as I can. This was a positive development because the upshot, it had to happen under political pressure and outside pressure and federal contracts and all that, but that over time, employers learned how to use black labor in jobs that blacks had been previously excluded from. So here's the graph that I showed yesterday, the case in South Carolina. The point is, here's an industry which, less than, I don't know just where it stood here, but, you know, roughly half of the labor force was female, and yet black females were excluded. White males included to the tune of 5%, but these were not the machine-tending jobs that were the major avenue for advancement. And the relative pay in textiles had increased quite a bit, beginning in the 20s, and then it was subject to the national minimum wage law. Farm labor was excluded, but this was included, and so that continued to rise in the 50s and 60s, and the educational qualifications continued to rise. So I don't see any sign here. You don't see it, I suppose, the eyeball test. It doesn't look to me like you were getting any gradual tendency to change as time went on. You got almost an overnight change beginning in 1964. And this has been studied with great detail and rigor by another Nobel laureate, this field. I've named 3 already, Becker, Arrow, and now Hersman, who did an empirical study of the integration of the textile industry in South Carolina using this same kind of data. And he concluded that it was a real revolution, at least in the sense that it was the legislative breakthrough that accounts for the change. Now, I have to deal with, you're free to ask questions, but let me anticipate some questions, ones that always come up. They say, well, it was the tight labor market conditions of the 60s that forced the change. That is, this large pool of excess white Southern labor was running out, the industry was growing rapidly, and they were going to have to turn to blacks sooner or later. The federal pressure just gave them a kind of an excuse or a push to do what really was in their industry, in their interest anyway. It wasn't the tight labor market. There's a quote, Richard Rowan, one of the leading experts from the Wharton School studies, he kind of dismissed it. He said, here's a case where, yeah, a lot of storm and drama on the Civil Rights Act, but the labor market was really forcing the change. But every rigorous study rejects this hypothesis, including Heckman. For one thing, you had earlier episodes of very tight labor markets, the 1902 to 07 period, World War I, World War II, hard-pressed to detect even a blip in the segregation lines during those periods of very tight labor market conditions. So, yeah, maybe the tight conditions made the difference in this historical episode, but in other words, there was something new here that made it have such a dramatic effect. The kind of evidence that they use to reject it is that you get virtually a simultaneous shift across the board in all the textile counties at just about the same time, associated with the legislation, independent of local labor market conditions. This group, yes, it's true, maybe young people were moving into the more advanced, more modern industries, but the textile work doesn't really prepare you, doesn't qualify you. Having worked in a textile mill for 25 years doesn't really make you a good candidate for moving into the chemical industry or the computer industry or something like that. Change correlated with county level labor market pressures, and you do find quotes saying, you know, this law was a blessing in disguise for us, but I say these rationalizations came after the fact. Yes, once they found, they reluctantly caved in. They found, you know, really, this was good for us, after all. So that by 1969, according to the New York Times, virtually all the large companies here have begun to preach a doctrine of equal colorblind employment. That's pretty fast learning, about 4 years. But I still think it makes a difference. You might say, well, you're moving from one equilibrium to another, and it's the two equilibria that count. I think it makes a difference to me in your overall vision of the civil rights revolution, whether you think the business community and the employee community was playing a leading role here, or whether they were playing a following role. And I say you did not find any of these textile mill managers up in Washington testifying in favor of this legislation. You'd think they would at least secretly be passing the word. They were not. They were opposed. Any public statement, there were hearings held in Charlotte in about 1966, and they snubbed the hearings. They were unwilling to. You'd think if they were this was a sort of a revolution that they were secretly in favor of, there would be some indication or track record of it. I can't find it. But they did learn quickly, and I'm not dismissing the importance of their capacity to adapt. Now, this literature, Heckman and others, face a challenge. How could such a modest federal enforcement effort have had such a dramatic effect here? It's a puzzle. That's one of the things that has led people to think that, well, maybe the employers really wanted to do this secretly. Because, I mean, the staffing of the office, the federal contract employment issue, you can find a difference between the firms that had federal contracts and those that didn't. That was a leverage, but the actual degree of enforcement was pretty darn small. How can it be that a little bit of leverage had such power? Well, here's a reason. I'm going to leave this up for a minute here while you ponder what it is here. It's a brochure coming out in, well, you can see I found this in the Stanford University library. It's just a little fold-out, widely distributed. It says September 1967. It really is a kind of a recruiting brochure for the industry. Textiles are getting a new look. It says 1960, Negroes in North and South Carolina, only 3.2%. But now it's up to 8.6%. The number of Negroes in textile jobs has been growing since 1960, and especially since Civil Rights Act 1964. How do you fit into the picture about your rights? And it was a fold-out. You can go to the back and find phone numbers and addresses, who to call. This had a powerful impact. They're telling people, you've long since given up on the possibility of being hired in this industry. You think they won't want you. I'm telling you, they're going to want you. They're going to have to take you, whether they want you or not. And if they give you any trouble, come to our office. I mean, this is a powerful threat. So it involved both the grassroots mobilization of large numbers of applicants and the threat, at least in the background, that you might lose your government contract or otherwise be taken to court. So you can understand why the employers felt they had to take at least a few of these. And just as you might think, there's a nice book on this by Timothy Minchin called Hiring the Black Worker. They did exactly what an economist would predict. The first few hires were the safe Negroes. They were people way overqualified, they were well-dressed, they were educated, and of course they were very, very good workers. So a little bit goes a long way. Certainly there were some rough times in terms of getting along in internal relationships, because the white workers certainly did think that this was threatening. But nobody lost their job because of it. The threatened large-scale walkouts never happened. And nobody's wage was cut. We might analyze eyes and say, well, the influx of black workers moderated the rate of increase of wages. I'm not denying that possibility, but it makes a difference if you have a growing industry with growing demand. So the strong labor market conditions certainly made a difference, but I'm saying you cannot explain away the development on those terms. So I think, and here's another slide that I showed yesterday, what happened was they learned on the job, the managers did. Here was this case of the manager from the Dan River Mills who had heard an announcement from some other mills that these new black workers were turning out to be pretty good workers. And he said, that's not what I'm hearing at all. From from the foreman, from the supervisors, they say, the Negroes, that we are employing are shiftless, lazy, don't want to work, and leave as soon as they're hired. So he commissioned a systematic company study. You might ask, why didn't he do this 10 years before, or 20 years before? Well, for one thing, it would have been hard to do such a study because there were no black workers in these jobs, so that would be a practical issue. The other thing is, I think he and the supervisor, they bought into this idea that blacks were going to be inferior workers. Maybe they're good for working in the blast furnace, but they can't do the fine motor skills, so that kind of rationalization. So it's an interesting story, from at least assuming if there's any truth in what I'm saying, it's an interesting story from that history of kind of a learning process on the part of employers, that you really can have profit-seeking employers, and these were not constrained by legal segregation laws. The whole industrial employment picture was virtually unregulated, and yet they were underperforming, as we now can see. Yeah.
What other potential causes got peeled away to say that this is the last one that's remaining? I mean, things like changes in mobility were possibilities. Could it be things like this actually allowed for mobility to make it for a thicker labor market, to allow for equalization across those counties? Could it be things like movement of the industry from like very rural areas to more population concentrated areas? What other causes had been ticked off to say that this is the one that remains?
Well, that's a challenging question, but I actually think if you really were to set out to reject all possible conceivable alternatives, it would be a lifetime assignment.
I was just wondering which ones were ticked off before you said the rest of them are just crazy.
What Heckman showed was, if you say you need an 8th grade education, it's small enough, but 8th grade makes a difference. He showed that there was a large minority in South Carolina of black population that met those qualifications.
Okay.
So I don't think we've gone very far down that list. I've got one later about other industries on the question of employer preference versus worker preference. I would say that's probably the leading candidate, the idea that the employer might have been willing to change, but he didn't want to cause disaffection among his incumbent white workers. If they all walked out, then he would really have a problem trying to staff the whole mill with completely inexperienced workers. I don't want to reject that one completely, because I do think fears about worker reaction were very real, and they contribute to the sustainability of the previous equilibrium, because that's what stops you from getting the kind of, if you could quietly slip some black workers into an inconspicuous location and try it out on an experimental basis. I have in Old South, New South some stories about during one of those early labor market tight period, long time before, around the turn of the century, there were a number of mills that experimented with black workers. And they did it with all black mills because they thought that mixing the races was going to be unacceptable. They looked on it almost like a kind of a laboratory experiment. People were keenly interested. You think, well, that's what will happen in a kind of dynamic economy where employers are trying to do better. They all failed. They all failed. And the upshot was to reinforce the belief that blacks just didn't fit into the industry. Now, we can say, well, they failed because they didn't have enough capital, they didn't have enough patience, they didn't really have faith in the black workers anyway. I think all those things are true, but you certainly were at a disadvantage if you were going to start a whole new industry with a completely inexperienced workforce. And so that would be another reason why. So my point is that this is fundamentally a market setting in which they were learning the wrong thing.
Okay.
proved it by the standards of logic or econometrics? No, clearly not.
Well, the other question was was there perhaps a natural experiment that was hiding around in there? Some county by county difference that had to do with timing of implementation. Maybe one area had a court case that was a stay or something along the lines, or something like that. No, not that lucky.
Not really. I mean, people look for that. I mean, the closest they come would be to distinguish firms with government contracts from those without. And yeah, you get a positive effect, but the timing is pretty much the same, whether they did or they didn't.
What was the time period you said that the experiment with the all-black mills was?
That was right around 1900. It was several of them in Georgia and in South Carolina. Some of them, a couple of them were sponsored by the Duke family. You know, they were in tobacco, and tobacco was actually a major employer of black labor in a segregated basis. But they were Republicans and considered liberals, you know, dangerous outside liberals. So it was natural that they would try not to manage, but to finance some of these things.
And the other question was,
Yeah.
in terms of unionization, when the mills were all white, was there unionization at that point, and did unionization come in or basically not come in at any point?
By and large, they were ununionized. Now, organizing the Southern mill workers was one of the big campaigns of the CIO, 1946, after the war, because this was a big growing industry, and of course, they were concerned about the New England workers who were unionized, or anywhere they were suffering. It was a failure. You know, Operation Dixie.
Right.
And you might think about the fact that these were well-paying jobs by Southern standards. I mean, the gap at that point between the textile wage and the farm wage was pretty big. Now, it doesn't mean you can't unionize, but the point is, if you have excess labor conditions, it's going to make it more difficult. So anyway, the basic point is this was an ununionized industry. Yes, John?
I was questioning you about this before, but this story here is much more complex than the statistical wage story.
Yes.
You might have started having the segregation or the higher wages for whites because the whites started to be better educated in the 20s and 30s, and so they became separate. But this statistical wage distribution is ultimately causing sort of an uninformed prejudice. This then gives people inaccurate assessment of the productivity of black workers.
Well, in part, my answer to your question at lunch, which was basically, since economics presumes that the employers are at least trying to learn better information over time, and I would think, well, we've got at this point half a century of learning the wrong thing, and I'm certainly not challenging. There's a social context and lots of other attitudinal contexts. But nonetheless, they're not getting any information that is undermining their belief that they've got good quality workers and they're good because they're white. And so you come to think, well, the education isn't really the cause. The education is a reflection of the fact that it's the whites who are, going to make better use of education. And these seem just like hapless, hopeless rationalizations, as we can see so clearly. But they seem to make sense at the times. So, my larger point here is I just do not think the South was, would they never have changed? You might want to say a few years down the road, maybe. I'm not saying it had to unfold in exactly this way. I'm saying that they were not on the basis of imminent change. And they didn't want to change, even though some of them came around fairly quickly. Let me take a different question. This is not one that has been asked, but it might well come up. People often say, and I recall Jim Heckman having to deal with this very question, oh yeah, they let him into textiles. Textiles just on the verge of collapse. The Titanic is going down and we'll let the blacks sit on the deck chairs. That is an anachronistic perspective. Yeah, Jack Greenberg, the great civil rights lawyer, he said that. Oh, we spent too much time on textiles. It was a declining industry. It was not a declining industry at that time. You had rising black employment. I estimate as many as 220,000 up to the early 1990s. Some of it was because of industry growth. Some of it was because of the black share. It never became an all-black industry. The point is, for that generation, this was of huge importance because it was a dramatic increase in living standards that was accessible to people who did not have advanced education. Maybe they had 8th grade, but they didn't have high school education. And the oral histories are just very touching and compelling about what a difference it made, for example, in sending the kids to college. Yes, obviously for the future, you weren't going to build the future of anybody's long-term future on the basis of these labor-intensive industries. But they were growing until the 90s. They pretty much collapsed in the 90s, but that 30-year span was crucial. And it certainly was a kind of good span of somebody's working career at the time. So that's my point, is that it was important both for the real people at the time, but also as a kind of a stepping stone for the households whose children were getting more schooling. Now, I don't want to spend the whole time on textiles, interesting as it is. We've got to move beyond textiles. Textiles was unusual in the speed with which integration took place. Most other industries dragged their feet. They were not quick to change. They often involved a lot of litigation, and it took quite a while before the severity of the legislation and the fact that the courts were really going to enforce it strictly, that became clear. A lot of employers thought they could get by just taking down the segregated restroom signs and maybe having an occasional black janitor promoted to something else. And ultimately, now I shouldn't say ultimately, but within a few years, the courts said, no, that is not going to be enough. We've had enough. We saw 10 years of foot dragging on schools with Brown versus Board of Education, and now we're seeing the very same thing happening in the employment sector, so that you're going to have to show some results here, and results have to be, nobody ever used the word quota, admit to it, but the critics were at a point when they said, you know, in a way you're really saying we have to hire more black workers, and we have to see that it's happening, and unless we collect data on this and measure it and set up some kind of targets, we're not going to be satisfied. This sure sounds like heavy-handed federal intervention, and I think the employers honestly thought, see, in textiles, you might say, well, that's an unskilled job, the skills are easy, you can learn quickly, but most employers, they thought for political reasons they were going to be forced to take large numbers of underqualified black workers, and that this was going to have an adverse effect on their bottom line. I argue that this was a genuine part of the Civil Rights Revolution. There was Griggs' case, which was Duke Power, 1971, which really said, here's another indication of the truth of my statement, that the pre-existing situation was a sustainable equilibrium from the employer's point of view. What did they do when they said you cannot discriminate on the basis of race anymore? They introduced testing procedures. That's what the Duke Power said. Yeah, we think we're relying on our hunch, our kind of folk knowledge that blacks are underqualified. You demand we can't use folk knowledge anymore, we're going to give them a test. So this group organized by Griggs and his co-authors, they were janitors. Duke hired black workers only in the janitorial department. They applied for a transfer, and they said, oh, well, you're welcome to take the test. And they took the test, and they all failed, and that was the upshot of the decision in the Griggs case was you just can't do that. You're going to come up with a test. You're going to have to show that that test has a valid relationship to the work requirements of that job. I mean, that is pretty heavy-duty intervention. I would never defend this as some kind of optimality plan. You can see the basis of the fear. The point I want to make here is, I had to read a book on that one case in order to appreciate this. I thought 1971, you get the idea, well, the real pressure here is coming from the courts. The point is, this was just like the textiles case in the sense that they applied for transfers directly in the wake of the Civil Rights Act, and it was, in this case, not people who were excluded entirely from the industry, but they were consigned to janitorial jobs, and they thought the act meant they had to have a shot at the jobs further up the line. As dramatic as it was before. It was a matter of, first of all, this is total employment, and as in the example I just gave you about group power, we're not really talking about total employment, we're talking about advancement from these completely segregated lines of progression. So the fact that you see anything here is interesting, but it's not as meaningful as a larger picture. Now, let me anticipate another question. Who's really behind all this, management or labor? Because another thing that economists love to do, especially if they encounter students who are labor sympathizing, labor union sympathizing, they say, look, take a look at the role of labor unions in the Civil Rights Revolution, and you'll find a lot of racists, a lot of Jim Crow. You'll find a lot of UAW members in Memphis who are also members of the Citizens Council. It's all true. But was that the fundamental cause? A case where the unions and the sentiment of the labor, white laborers in general, were the main cause of this vertical segregation? I don't think so, because you do not find any cases of Southern employers. I mean, if they were going to use race to bust a union, they should have been in Washington encouraging the facilitation of this. They were not. They didn't like any of this. They resisted. They applied testing procedure. They hired lawyers. There's the point. Often their first response was to institute testing requirements for the jobs. Certainly would not want to deny that labor was part of the problem here. But the organizing, the state labor councils were at least in there, offering an alternative vision, an alternative appeal to the white workers, saying, you know, you can look at things differently, you can see the commonalities of the interest, and of course, you can't prove economically that one way of looking at it is more economically correct, but at least the labor groups were in there. Yeah, they supported freedom riders, they did various things. No doubt they would never have done that if they'd had to have a vote of all the white laborers in the states. But nonetheless, there was a progressive vision that to some degree, some parts of the labor movement were pushing. Yes?
What about the role of the churches during this time and the view of segregation as a moral issue?
Well, that is certainly interesting, because I would have said, coming out of my experience in North Carolina in 1963, that the churches were part of the problem too. Martin Luther King said, 11 o'clock on Sunday is the most segregated hour in the South. And that was so true, and I'm afraid my friends in Warrenton tell me it's still true. You have a lot more casual mixing in lots of spheres of life, but churches are still segregated. And here and there you found a brave minister who was speaking out, but they were at risk of their jobs if they did. However, I think maybe my belief, that cynical belief, is probably overstated. There's a book by David Chappelle talking about the role of the church. You know, there were not many were way out front joining the demonstrations. He used the case of Billy Graham. I don't want to get too sidetracked here. Billy Graham befriended Martin Luther King, and as of sometime in the early 50s, he said, my audiences are going to be integrated. So he was not entirely as backward as you might think. He never joined a demonstration or took any active role. So I do think the kind of, if you look, well, what I looked at is the groups they were trying to mobilize after the Civil Rights Act of '64. And they're looking, look, this is going to happen. We need to go to respected members of the community to kind of make it happen in the most facilitated. Yeah, certainly the religious leaders were ones, along with business leaders. So that's I don't think they're really on the front lines in this labor kind of thing, but you know, it's a more mixed group. They were definitely people with less of an all-out commitment to at least these spheres, to public accommodations and labor, even if they were pretty segregated in their own congregations. Okay, next slide is, oh yes, here's a favorite quote of mine, and this is a book by Stanley Greenberg. He now has become famous as a pollster, but he was a scholar, anthropologist at Yale, wrote a book which was a comparative study of South Africa and the South. And it's interesting because it came out in 1980 at a time when nobody knew what was going to happen in South Africa. But he did some oral, I don't know if you can call it, yeah, I guess it's oral history, talking to the managers in the state of Alabama of various firms, as he had done in South Africa. And I've emailed him trying to get through, saying, do you have transcripts from those interviews? Because I'd sure like to have them. No, at least I haven't had a response on that. But what he found was that even after the fact, he couldn't find a single case before the 1960s, that is before the federal government began to come down on this, where firms drawing on cost calculations, business norms, or abstract concept of justice chose to desegregate the workplace or break down job discrimination. Even in retrospect, off the record, within the confines of their own offices, businessmen did not recall that the racial order created impediments or difficulties for enterprises. Okay, it's not statistical proof, no. But I think it's a powerful statement. They couldn't see, there are lots of other areas in the South where typically political figures, George Wallace apologized. They got Joe Smitherman, the sheriff in Selma. What I did was wrong. He gave this, put on a kind of reformed redneck act for tourists. You do not find these employers saying, what we were doing was wrong. They might, maybe, I'm sure you could find some who said it was wrong. But the idea that it was inefficient or that we were sacrificing profits for indulgence, you just don't see it. Now here's another topic for you young economic students. Suppose you were to approach an issue like this from the standpoint of maybe an assignment for a term paper. What you would do, you want to test this hypothesis that there really was a breakthrough on the demand side. The first thing you'd want to do is control for education as best you can. Education, experience, family background, anything else you can measure. And this is the debate between Heckman and Richard Freeman on the other side. And Smith and Welsh on the other side. Smith and Welsh say it's all education. Take a long view, it's all education. And Freeman and Heckman say, no, if you do a demand curve for black labor and control for education, you find that there's an upward shift right around 1964. So that's their case. Say it really was legislation. The point I'm making is, it's not that I reject that, it's that if you look at it that way, you are missing the main historical action here, which is the complementarity between educational and occupational advance. That these new opening up of job opportunities that were never available for blacks gave a positive incentive for blacks to stay in school and get a high school degree and go on to college if they could, and you got dramatic advances. Now they had a reason to be there. Indeed, the article by Card and Kruger often cited because they have evidence that there certainly was a long-term improvement in the relative quality of black schooling right down to 1964. That's one of Smith and Welsh's main points, is, yeah, there was improvement going on, you can't deny that. But there was a sharp upward shift in the return to that education as measured by Card and Kruger. I think the upward shift was caused by the Civil Rights Act. So that you got the black high school graduation rate rising from 35% in 1960 to 57%, 71%, and so on. Richard Freeman shows a big upsurge in recruitment visits to historically black colleges. Of course, these were employers from all over the country, but they were going to have to come to the South to the historically black colleges because if they wanted to hire and recruit black college graduates, that's where they were going to have to go, and they wanted to do it on short notice. Now here's a graph that may, this is a synthesis. I'm using other people's work here. If I had to do it all myself, I'm not sure I'd have that much to say. But it's another study by Che, Gurion, and Zunger, not yet published. But they've actually found, they've worked with various things, but this is the armed forces qualifying test. And looking at the gap between whites and blacks. The two lines here, three lines are just different measures. It's a complex graph. It is the gap between the South and the Rust Belt, by which they mean basically the industrial Midwest. And the year here is the so that you want to, let's see, it says the year of birth, so it must be the year of birth. The point is, I think the cohort born in 1962 was basic. Here, I need to come clean with you. These guys associate this mainly with breakthroughs in public health, in improved infant mortality and infant health conditions, and they say, look what a striking effect it had on test performance a few years later. I don't deny that at all, but I want to say I associate this with desegregation of schools. And the reason I do that is there are many other studies showing that despite all the resistance and all the white flight, there's a positive effect of desegregation on black educational attainment and occupational attainment, long-run outcomes, and health outcomes, and test scores. So this is pretty striking. The South goes from far below the national norm to actually surpass the Rust Belt by, well, this date was 5 to 10 years. So it supports my general claim that there was more happening in the South than elsewhere. In fact, a lot of positive things. Of course, within a few years, there are some very negative things happening in the Rust Belt in the form of industrial decline. Yeah.
But also, part of the effectiveness of the civil rights legislation could have been to improve health.
Indeed. No, indeed. I don't, my only complaint is that they dismiss desegregation of schools, and they want to put it exclusively in health, and I think they don't really...
A stronger test would be to break it out and look at differences by race. Is what you have accumulation of both black and white scores? In other words, if I were to look at the cohort of specific race, and I wanted to assume that blacks were very favorably impacted by the 64 Civil Rights Act, I want to have a separate black and white graph there, as have all yours. So what's their data?
You know, I've tried to get their data. They're very cooperative, but they can't share that data with me. This is I really probably cannot use this in my book. It's a two-way. This is the white-black gap that's what's being measured here.
Oh, okay.
And then they're comparing it between the Rust Belt and the South. So it's a different kind of graph, and that probably makes it a little too complex for,
There was a period of time when you had textiles still in the Northeast, and you had them in the South, and the South was sort of out-competing the textiles in the North.
Yeah.
And originally, that was also, there was an all-white labor force in the textiles in the South. Now, presumably at that point, there was a wage differential.
Yes.
And I'm curious what happened to the wage differential for textile workers between North and South when all of a sudden you get the big increase of blacks coming into the Southern textile, whether or not that gap between between North and South textile wage rate got bigger.
See, by 1965, the New England textile industry had pretty much died.
So it was already dead.
It was already dead. Now, the gap, the inter-regional wage gap, was a lot smaller than you might think, because I really think that's one of the main forces behind the minimum wage legislation of the 1930s, was to push up that Southern wage. So it was way above the supply price of labor. It was still a positive gap, but we're talking about maybe 10 to 20% as opposed to 50%. And maybe it succeeded in slowing down the expansion of the Southern industry, but it didn't stop it. Okay, let me move forward. Yeah, here's an interesting debate. It sounds like I'm jumping to different topics, but these are all different aspects of the same one. There was an interesting debate in the 1960s, early 1960s, before the legislation, between the advocates of compulsion and the advocates of voluntarism. We had the same debate, public accommodations. But it was happening in labor. There was a program called Plans for Progress, founded in 1961. And the first director was a good old boy from Atlanta. He was a good old boy from Atlanta who had been a college classmate of Robert Kennedy at Harvard University, a real insider. He talked a good line. and he founded something called Plans for Progress, which is we're going to get the business leadership of the whole country together, and together we're going to fix this problem by hiring more black workers. And he made this case, which is compulsion is not the thing. If you just do it on the basis of compulsion, I'm a lawyer, I can show you how to get around the executive order, it's got to be voluntary. Well, of course, this is self-interested, this is delusional. The verdict of history is clearly it didn't work. Progress was very, very slow under voluntarism. The major progress came only after EEOC action, private lawsuits, federal contract compliance, and the evidence is that the greatest gains in black employment were at covered employers as opposed to uncovered. So it seems like this theory, it's like the voluntary solution to public accommodations. It's on the scrap heap of history, and yet if we think about it now, we're a little bit removed from the times. You know, he did have a point. If all they ever hired was just the bare minimum required by law, and you couldn't get a job or a promotion without a lawyer or a federal official, you wouldn't really expect much. You got to have some buy-in at some level by the employers, and I actually think the subsequent studies with enough time horizon to make a difference indicate that really is what happened. They did buy in. They didn't buy in at the start. Some of them never even thought they would be affected, but once they realized that they were going to have to hire substantial, measurable numbers of black workers, they had to buy in to the idea, at least we're going to have to make productive use of them, and that means we've got an interest in improving race relations. Now sure, the difference between compulsion and voluntarism is not clear-cut. Secretary of Labor, Ray Marshall, still going strong, says, yeah, there's something about the threat of prosecution that makes voluntary programs work much better. But there's a nice book by a sociologist at Harvard named Frank Gavin called Inventing Equal Opportunity, and he says, you know, the real heroes of the civil rights revolution, it's not the lawyers, it's not even the grassroots activists, it's the personnel officials in these big corporations. I'm not saying you have to accept, we don't have to choose sides here, but they're the ones that really had to figure out how to make it work, because the courts could enforce the law. They could, and the federal government could deny a contract. Those things happened occasionally. But to actually come up with a formula that you could use in a workable way within the firm and then explain it to the court in a way that they would accept it, that's a real challenge. And the personnel officials came up with ways to do it, and they couldn't do it by just adopting colorblindness. They had to think a lot about race and race relations. Well, there's the answer. They had internalized the civil rights movement, and his best evidence is that in the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan came in, and one of his things was, I'm going to do away with this wasteful, inefficient interference, affirmative action. By that time, corporate America didn't want to do it. They pushed back. They had bought into it. Of course, you would think had they really wholeheartly bought into it? That might be questionable. But at least they had set up their systems, and they didn't want to have to scrap those systems. And they didn't want to be told, the threat, that they were going to be shot down or declared illegal for making some use of race-conscious measurements and indicators in their job assignments. So basically, that part of the civil rights revolution stuck, even while others were being undermined. My only complaint about Frank Gavin's book is, like almost all the literature in this area, they don't pay any attention to the South, and they don't pay any attention to region, and in fact, the gains that he's talking about were much greater in the South than elsewhere. Here's a piece of news, one I've not shown before, using the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission reports. I haven't yet dug into the firm-level reports, but these are just the state-level reports. You can see, I've aggregated two. The white-collar South is the squares on the blue, and then I have another one called skilled crafts, so that's blue-collar in the skilled category. What you can see is that in 1986, the lowest one of them all is black skilled craft. White collar was slightly higher in the South because of demography, but they're both pretty low. What you can see is by far the greatest gains in black employment status in these companies. These are just large employers, not the whole population. was in the South. How is it that somehow scholars of the race issue in America have missed this fundamental feature? I'm not sure why. Well, we can conjecture, maybe we can even have a discussion about it, but I think I'm calling attention to something where I don't really need a statistical test to show you that there's a big regional effect and regional difference here. Now, I'm going to zip through my next few tables, but I'm trying to respond to this very pessimistic literature that says, you know, nothing much was accomplished. Look at a city like Charlotte, and I'm just using occupational evidence from the census. So we've got a lot more categories, but these are 3 middle-class job categories: professional, managers, and sales. Sales jobs in particular, that's an interesting one because it involves contact with the public, so you've got consumer discrimination along with fellow worker and employer. So at 2.7% in 1950, a lot of industrialization and progress in Charlotte between 1950 and 1960. It stood at 2.5% in 1960. I think these breakthroughs in racial employment, breaking down segregation barriers, were not some kind of automatic byproduct of industrialization and urbanization and economic progress, or modernization. Same thing with managers. The share went down. Professionals, a little misleading perhaps, because professionals includes ministers and school teachers. And of course, segregated schools and churches, you did have a lot of that in the South. But my point is, if you look at the overall picture after 1960, what you see is rising absolute numbers and rising black share. So in professionals, it's up to 19%, managers is up to 16%, and sales is up to 20%. Still underrepresented, that's true, in the year 2000, but actually that is not that far below the black share of the population in Charlotte, which is still somewhere in the 30% range. So, in other words, a lot of occupational progress in Charlotte. You might say, well, Charlotte, that's North Carolina, that's New South, that's not special. Well, how about Atlanta? Atlanta prided itself on its progressive racial attitude. They weren't doing much. The managerial thing actually went down between 1950 and 1960. Sales number did go up. The point is, you see enormous progress in the city of Atlanta over time the rise of middle-class occupation, middle-class population. In the case of Atlanta, it is so successful that you've had a white influx into Atlanta, so that these numbers actually, the absolute numbers don't go down at the white share. That's a sign of success, not a sign of failure, because it means Atlanta has been, by and large, with all the many things you might say about it, an economic success story under black political leadership, which has shown a good deal of favoritism, you might say, towards black economic interests and black employment. How about Birmingham, Alabama, the most disastrous case in the whole state, a state that was the most disastrous case for race relations, but it compounded that disaster with an economic collapse because this was a steel town and the steel industry collapsed by the 1970s. You might have thought that was a place so hopeless that it could be left for dead. Well, that city has remade itself. And blacks have been well represented in remaking that image, so much so that the professional category is more than half black. Of course, the demography is different. Managers is up to 34%, and sales is up to 62%. That's a black majority city. It has remade itself mainly on the basis of the University of Alabama, Birmingham, and the health research and hospital facility there, which throws up a lot of pretty good middle-class jobs in which blacks are well represented. Probably a bit better than those textile mill jobs that were dropping out. I know Birmingham has had its share of problems, as all these cities have, but the point is, overall, I think there's a lot of progress here. People always want to see, well, here's black occupational shares, so this is, for the aggregate of the census, showing you that, oh, look at managers, for example, it's 2 to 1. In the South compared to the North. And in the case of sales, it's close to 3 to 1. Professional, it's also a case of 2 to 1. If you look instead, let me just show the next one and then take a question, at shares relative to the population, which perhaps is what you were going to ask. You know, in a way I prefer not to, but if people want to see it, here's what you see. Let's focus on managers. You can see how far behind the South was in 1950. And it was even farther behind in 1960. This all supports my point that this was not happening in the South without civil rights and federal pressure. And then you have these enormous gains in both both North and South. So if you just look at managers, you might say to me, well, the reason the South gained more is that they were farther behind to start with, and so some of it's a catch-up. But you have to remember that we're getting black in-migration into the South, that to some degree the denominator has an endogenous component too. Look at clerical, that industry that was shutting black women out over all these years. They really were shut out, and they were still being shut out. Any black woman who got a high school degree was likely to leave the South. But then, when things turned around, they went back to the South. So that we actually get, yeah, it was happening both. Mary King, by the way, has an article on the tipping phenomenon in clerical employment. This is what she's writing about. I'm adding a regional dimension, which I think is important. And here you have a case where sales, South is way behind, it's pretty much equal, and you even have a slight advantage in the skilled blue collar. So yeah, looking at this way, it's maybe a little less dramatic, but let me show you the next couple of slides. Here's the net black in-migration. This is a reason why I feel so confident that this is, these changes are real. And that's the black people voting with their feet. After leaving the South by the millions, during this whole period of history, we got a turnaround. Using census data, the turnaround starts in 1970, but in those textile areas, you were getting an influx of black workers dating from 1965. As soon as they knew, these were people with roots in the South, and lots of reasons to want to be in the South, and the reason for not being in the South was no job opportunities. The big change, some of this unfolded only decades later, but I'm still saying it's an effect of the Civil Rights Revolution because I interpret the Civil Rights Revolution as fundamentally a regional phenomenon. This is a study by the demographer named Frey, The New Great Migration. Here are all the leading cities of black in-migration. This one is 1985 to 1900. And this one is during the dot-com boom of 1995 to 2000. Atlanta's at the top, both tables. But look, almost all these cities are in the South. Norfolk, Raleigh-Durham, Dallas, Orlando, Richmond, San Diego. I don't know what Minneapolis is doing here, but it's not over here. Here you've got Atlanta, Dallas, Charlotte, and so on. This is Columbia, South Carolina. We can debate some of the regional categorization. My point is, blacks are moving in the South, and by and large, by this point in history, these are people with education, and they're moving down because there are opportunities in corporate employment or professional activities or something closely related. Will you? Yeah. I will, in fact, be finished in 5 minutes because this is, here's a couple of pictures I showed before. This is median male black income comparing South, Midwest, and Northeast. So the South in 1960 was the low-income area. It was for the whole population, but especially so for blacks. Southern blacks were at the low end of the totem pole, and by the end of the century, so this thick blue line here to say that it was no longer the low-income region for blacks. Yes, a lot of this is compositional. I'm not saying these are all people who were in the South during this whole period. There's selective migration, but the point is, I think it's happening in the South. The place where the action was in the South. Here's a regression, and since I'm short on time, I'll say that this confirms the results I'm just showing you, that you get, in fact, a goal for race and region. Well, maybe I should take a minute on it, because this is important. This overall black coefficient is negative, and it's actually larger in 2000 than it was in 1960. So this is why people say the Civil Rights Revolution really didn't solve the racial equity issue. There's a lot of truth in that. But if you look at the South, that went from a big negative to virtually zero, and the interaction between them is actually positive by 2000. And here's the comparison between blacks in the South and whites in the South, where notice the line was declining in the 50s, begins to turn in the early 60s. Remember, some of these employment pressure breakthroughs were happening in the early 60s, but the big change comes after 1964, so that this ratio is going from 40% here to 60% here to 75% at the end of the century. Very least, I want to say it's a big change, and there's a lot of action, and you're going to miss most of it if you don't see it in a regional perspective. I've got a few more slides to amplify things, but maybe this is a good one to conclude on, especially if somebody has a question that you haven't had a chance to ask so far.
Anyone like to ask questions?
I have sort of a detailed question.
Nico?
A detail.
Yes.
You earlier said that Jim Eckman showed there was lots of high school graduates at the time of the Civil Rights Act who were available, high school graduates who work in these skilled jobs, but how does this square to the fact that these tests that the unions and the corporations put in place were so effective in keeping the blacks out? If there were, maybe it was really true outside of textiles that there weren't the skilled blacks.
So I think what I actually said, what he actually said was 8th grade education.
Okay.
For the textile business, right, which was pretty much typical. So there were plenty of those. But you know, that article, he goes on to say that after controlling for educational attainment, he concludes that textiles was the only industry in which he can document discrimination. Now, how could he possibly make such a claim when you had such blatant, outright segregation and exclusion and so on? But rather than say, well, he's dead wrong, I prefer to interpret that as saying, well, what you're seeing is that the jobs more or less matched up with the educational level of the ones holding the job. It's not so much that they didn't discriminate, it's that the outcome of this deep-seated discrimination was a kind of an equilibrium type of balance, which is why I think once it was disrupted, you got both sides of it, both promotion opportunities and an encouragement to education. So that's the way I would put that together. So that's more than a question, that's actually quite significant.
Well, I'd encourage anyone who has a further question to perhaps come and speak with the individually. Join me in thanking Professor